Mr. Rudd, thanks for your time this evening. Setting aside the question of the money that's been blown on the French submarines, in a big picture sense, does this move make strategic sense for Australia?
I think the conditions which Anthony Albanese has articulated are probably about right, which is, let's be very clear about can these submarines be sustained in the absence of an Australian domestic nuclear industry? Can we do it in a way which does not lead to any expectation downstream on the part of our allies that these vessels would end up being nuclear armed, or any home porting for US nuclear armed submarines in Australia? And finally, those non-proliferation treaty obligations. I think if these things can be clarified, but also in addition to that, any operational expectations which the Americans would have over these units in the future, then there's possibly a way through. But these are very serious thresholds which need to be crossed.
Wouldn't the Americans have pretty high expectations, given that they're the ones sharing their technology and nuclear secrets?
To be blunt, Leigh, is there an operational expectation that if the balloon went up and you had a major conflict, not a crisis, but a conflict over Taiwan and in the South China Sea, or even in the East China Sea as the relationship with Japan unfolds, is there an expectation that these units would be deployed in the midst of that? We need clarification on those sorts of questions as well. These are ultimately Royal Australian Navy assets. They are not the joint assets of the United States or the United Kingdom. And if you read that statement that came out today, there's some language to that effect. I believe clarifying our national interest in all this is fundamentally important.
Interoperability has been the buzzword in Australian military policy for a couple of decades, meaning that Australian equipment works very closely in concert with American equipment and vice versa. Given that, does Australia really have sovereignty over its military policy, or is it an additional arm of the US military in the Pacific?
On operability, I do believe in alliance solidarity and complementarity in terms of our kit and equipment. But ultimately, there are sovereign decisions about where these assets are deployed. And I believe that's fundamental to the decision which would be faced by an incoming Australian Labor government on these sorts of submarines if the project was to go ahead. But Leigh, they're talking about an 18-month delay. There's a critical point to be made here. We're now looking at that delay. We're looking at, frankly, this force not being available and on one reading until 2040. We are being left strategically naked for 20 years based on what I do see to be the bungling of this new submarine project, which was, after all, launched by my government in 2009.
Is there anything to be worried about for Australia being left, as you put it, strategically naked for 20 years?
Well, submarine force is quite critical to our own forward defence. Remember, these assets are designed, at the end of the day, for the defence of Australia. We have, in addition to that, alliance obligations. What I'm concerned about is with this ageing Cockham's fleet of 6 boats, where they will stand by the time whatever upgrade might occur to them by 2030, let alone by the time we reach 2040. What we launched in 2009 was a document called Force 2030, because we understood the natural ageing of the fleet. And this is leaving us, I think, vulnerable for this decade, but in particular, vulnerable for the following decade.
When you say we're vulnerable, who's coming for us, though?
In terms of any future scenario, and it's not profitable to identify individual states, because we know from recent history how unpredictable our strategic environment can be. But what we need to have with our force capabilities is a structure which is able to be deployed against a whole range of contingencies in our immediate region.
How likely is China to interpret this move as directed at it and then use it to justify its own military expansion?
Well, the Chinese would not have to look far in terms they would see President Biden's statement when this announcement was made to conclude that this is directed at China. One of my arguments in terms of the Australian government's forward defence, as it were, planning and preparations, is that it is too overt in the way in which it uses its language on these questions. It's far better that we develop our kit and equipment as Australia around a range of contingencies and not engage in loose public rhetorical language about it being directed against one country or another. Because what that does, Leigh, is just compounds our problems rather than actually reduces them in the meantime. But the question for Australia is, are you going to be an intelligent ally in response to that and develop the capabilities able to defend Australia against a range of contingencies, assist our allies as needed, or are you going to be an unintelligent ally, take out a megaphone and broadcast an assault against Beijing rhetorically any day of the week, and therefore, as a consequence, paint a very large target on our forehead? I think that's unintelligent behaviour, and I would caution Mr Dutton and Mr Morrison from going further down that road.
Kevin Rudd, thank you for your time.
Good to be with you.
Hi, I'm Leigh Sales. Thanks for watching this story. If you'd like to watch more of 730's stories, they are on the left of your screen. And tap on the button below to subscribe and get the latest from ABC News.